Hello and welcome. Last week you heard our conversation of the Chapter 9 discussion from 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. This week we wanted to share a part of the conversation that I felt deserved its own episode, in that we discuss more in depth one of the clients from Peterson's practice that he discusses in the chapter. Austin brings really good insight. Pat, Austin, and I also bring different perspectives from what we've read, and we try to come to a better understanding together based on our perspectives. So the subject matter that the client was dealing with is sensitive, and we want to be understanding of that. Nevertheless, I think we do a good job of trying to sort out what is being discussed in the book while also talking about what was going on in the culture at the time. Without further ado, please enjoy the episode.
Hello and welcome to the Being and Becoming podcast. Together, we are being honest in conversations about thoughts we're having and books we're reading in the hopes of becoming better, more able versions of our current selves. My name is Logan Hauer. Today we will be discussing Chapter 9, Assume that the person you are listening to might know something you don't, from 12 Rules for Life and Antidote For Chaos by Jordan Peterson. I'm joined today by my two regular hosts, Austin Stone and Patrick Dyer. How are we doing today, guys?
Hello. 2 thumbs up.
Thumbs up. Nice. So I just wanted to turn it over to you guys to see any initial thoughts. Austin, I know that there was something that you really wanted to share that had struck you early in this chapter.
Yeah, so here we are in Chapter 9. Chapter 9 is Assume the person you're listening to might know something you don't. And Peterson talks about how psychotherapy is not advice. And throughout this chapter, he talks about the importance of going along with the client and listening, and not trying to impose your mindset onto them. And then he goes into the story of this client, this woman that he had as a client. And he kind of describes her as someone where life was happening to her. She was having trouble living life actively in a disciplined manner, and just all these things were starting to kind of happen to her, and she was just not living a lazy life, but living a pretty purposeless life. And here's a quote. He describes this client of his as a walking cacophony of unintegrated experiences. What did we think of that usage of words? Does that make sense? Can you guys kind of explain what you think he meant?
I think, Austin, you had actually explained it well in saying that this was a person that life was happening to and not someone that was maybe the main character of their own life. I guess that's a poor way of saying it.
No, that's good.
Yeah, I think that's what he would mean by that phrase.
Agreed.
Patrick agrees. Okay. So Peterson is talking about this client of his, and it ends up him revealing the fact that she had some experiences of sexual assault. And this is kind of the part of the book that I have the most problem with Peterson. And I think it's important for me to mention this because I want anyone who's reading this book and has a problem with Peterson to know that there's, I think, robust critiques of Jordan Peterson that exist, because I think a lot of his followers are so hardcore and love him so much, and there's so much I enjoy from him, but it's also important to give a balanced perspective on any individual because we all have problems and we all have short-sightedness in our life. My problem with how he described this story was he's kind of talking about how these things are just happening to her. She's having trouble finding a disciplined system, having trouble trying to find, a purposeful way of living. And then she ends up having these experiences where she looks back and she thinks that she was sexually assaulted. And he kind of was like, well, that's what you get for walking an unintegrated life, or you're just allowing life to happen to you. I do think he was making a point here, but he could have been more careful with how he brought up the situation. And he kind of criticizes the rise of the Me Too movement, kind of like a victim-centered movement he kind of sees it as, and I find that kind of unacceptable. I'll park it there and see if you guys have something to say.
Was there somewhere in the chapter where he talks about it being did you say a victim-centered movement? Is that... Or is this your impression based on listening to him?
He talks about how there's this rising movement of women talking about their experiences, and he has a critique. I'm having trouble finding where in the chapter he says that, and that's bad form on my part.
I didn't catch that if that was in the book, but I do see the value in what you're saying. He does not appear to be very sympathetic to what his client was going through. I think I would have trouble saying, though, he believes that's what she gets. I believe that he's not, he doesn't feel sorry for her. Or no, he does feel sorry. What am I trying to say? This is such a difficult issue to talk about. I think that he does feel sorry for her, but he, at the same time, maybe I do agree with you then. Like, yeah, he feels bad for her, but he's kind of asking, what would you expect to happen?
Yes, that's what he says. He doesn't say
right.
That's what she gets. She said, what would she expect to happen?
What? Yeah, okay.
Which is a big difference. Big difference.
So you guys are making a good point. He doesn't say, this is what you get. He's kind of talking about the life she was living, getting drunk often, going to parties. And he's like, when people get drunk, when you party like no tomorrow, trouble can happen, and when that happens, sexual assault can happen sometimes. So I found it fairly unempathetic. On page 236, he does talk about the media, and he said while this story was going on with the client, the media was filled with stories of recovered memories, particularly of sexual assault. And this is him still talking. He says, is it just mounting rage, or are they genuine accounts of past trauma? So he's kind of questioning this movement here. Are they like after the fact constructions of what happened because, you're mad with your experiences with men? After that paragraph, I kind of took a step back from the book and I was like, I think Peterson crossed a line here. I think he's giving an unbalanced critique of this movement. He is someone who emphasizes personal responsibility, and I think that's a good point. But using this example, I think, was not to get his point across because, including myself, there's a lot of people who stop listening when you give an unbalanced view of women trying to make their voices heard. So that's my critique. I hope I made that clear enough. And I hope I represented all parties well enough.
So what should he have said then?
I don't think he gives that movement enough credibility. I think he should say something like, it's good that women are standing up when they felt like they couldn't in the past. I think that women who are assaulted need to have a voice, and I think they haven't. I'm speaking very generally here, but in general, I think a lot of women haven't had a lot of voices to where they felt like they could stand up against men who've been against them because they're just going to be seen as this uncredible voice against this maybe a powerful or credible man in a position where, they have a lot to lose if this story comes out. I think it's a complex issue, and he didn't give the complexity the right credibility.
With this story in particular, you were picking up more on what was happening in the media in the Me Too movement. I thought this story pertained more to his critique with Freud, like the first time I was reading the chapter. Again, I have not looked into this necessarily, but he in the book says that Freud's method was a lot of times focused on finding a past trauma in childhood, assault potentially, and then drawing that out of the person. And even at one point, I think he says, critiquing other psychologists, saying that they're so willing to let their theory live that they're willing to cause a lot of harm to people in recalling these stories. It wasn't clear to me. It seemed like it could have been implied that maybe they were tainting or fabricating or maybe just misremembering. I was not very clear on that, but that was from this story. That was more of what I thought he was trying to say instead of offering a comment on the movement itself. I think your critique's very fair, And I think, to your point, if he had just offered a caveat, or let me ask this, do you think if he had offered a caveat saying there are people going through legitimate suffering and harm regarding assault, do you think that maybe would have alleviated some of your understanding of that reading?
Yeah, it would alleviate it for sure. I think it would definitely help, but I don't see that in here, and that's why I'm saying what I'm saying. Yeah.
Right.
And it's sad to me because the points he's trying to make, at least for me, and I think a lot of other people, start to become a little more invalid because he didn't come at this with a little bit more of a balanced perspective. And I'm not here to just roast him. I'm here to kind of be like, oh, that's unfortunate, because I do think he has good things to say, and he didn't do the best job in this situation.
I think it's interesting he chose a story in which he admits life is very complicated and that he didn't know if she had been assaulted and she didn't know if she had been assaulted. So they end up terminating their counseling agreement. I imagine that has a lot to do with it. I think, too, she would probably benefit from speaking with another woman counselor. I don't know that for certain, but I would imagine that'd be helpful if you're trying to determine something like that. But, again, this is an area I can claim I don't know much about, and I'm open to learning.
I've kind of ran across this with Peterson and some other conservative intellectuals. I've kind of seen how their opinion is formed by the extremism of the political left. And I think it's good to have critiques of any political side, because every political side is going to have extremes. But when you make your, opinion, and other people are worse than this than Peterson, but they start to make their opinion based off of the worst of a political extreme. So then it's like, oh, well, now your opinion's starting to become extreme, and now we're super polarized.
And I'm sorry, is this in reference to this specific story, or is this a point
This
more
can
general?
reference to some people's reactions to the Me Too movement, because they see, I think extreme outliers of this movement, and how it can, where women are lying, because that does happen sometimes. Women have this ability to lie like any human, and then these men are fired or whatever, the consequences for something that didn't happen honestly, and they only highlight those situations, and then that can start to invalidate this movement trying to give voices to women. And I'm like, ooh, I don't think we should be forming our opinions on the extremism of the other side.
Yeah, again, I don't know much about this, and we were talking a little bit about it before the call, but I don't think it's ever a bad thing to give a voice to someone that has gone through assault or suffering or of really any kind. I'm on board with everything you're saying regarding shedding light on maybe people that were afraid to speak up, but empowering them to speak up if they're uncomfortable or in an uncomfortable situation. I think everyone would support that.
But that's not what he's saying, though, right?
Peterson or Austin?
Both. We're not saying that he's suggesting the Me Too movement shouldn't exist or that people shouldn't have a voice for this.
He's not saying that, but he is questioning it. On page 236, he questions it. And it relates to what Logan was saying about Freud. Like, Peterson sees that some therapists try to relate every problem to a sexual past, like a messed up sexual past. And he's like, when you do that, you can start to create something. And I think he might be alluding to the fact that doing that can create a movement like this. He's just saying, are these just post hoc constructions dreamed up as a consequence of pressure? The pressure that therapists are putting on these clients to try to figure out if their problems are related to their sexual past? That's what he's questioning there.
Austin, let me ask you this. Maybe we can all come to an understanding, or at least understand where we're all at. Do you think there was a reason he chose the story? And if so, is the reason because he thought it summarized this movement? Is that your perspective?
I think his comment about the media is peripheral to his point, but he makes it.
I guess I was saying, so that aside, the comment about the media, do you think he shared this story specifically because he would identify this woman as the type of person that would be involved in this movement.
Yes. Because in his situation with this client, she's unsure if sexual assault happened. And he was thinking if there was a different therapist with her, that this different therapist would try to really play into that and maybe try to convince her that she was sexually assaulted and that she's the victim, and then wouldn't really deal with the fact that she's been getting drunk all the time and wouldn't be trying to take more personal responsibility. And I see how Peterson would have a problem with that, but it's such a complex issue. I felt like it was unbalanced the way he dealt with it. Can I hear your thoughts, Patrick?
I suppose he, at least from the perspective I was gaining, because I mean later on in the chapter he talks about not exactly figuring it out for yourself, but pretty much exactly what you're saying, adopting the personal responsibility. Because I mean, I can't say much more than what I can just reiterate what you just said. I mean, she was getting drunk all the time, putting herself in these situations, which is not to blame, but it's just such a risk. And she inherently knows the risk, as we all do. But I don't think he was minimizing her conflict or her trauma. I think he's just trying to make the point that she's able to teach him something through this. I don't know if he would have said this about advice maybe if he hadn't heard this story before. Kind of what I get from it, I guess. I don't have a good way to explain that, but
That makes sense. Because at the beginning of the chapter, Patrick, he's talking about people who impose their understandings of the world on people.
Yes, exactly.
You know, if they have a personal vendetta.
He's trying to explain that she's talking and he's listening. She's listening and he's talking. That this is truly a genuine conversation, which he says is psychotherapy, which is helping her sort the things out as she needs. Because often, I don't know if he says it in the book. He may, I don't remember. But in some of his podcasts and episodes he's been on, he always talks about how talking out loud is the best form of thinking. And that's kind of what he's getting at for her, to help her name her, for lack of a better word, her downfalls, in figuring out how to go from there.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Patrick. It seems like Peterson saw her as someone who just didn't really think about the decisions she was making, had trouble kind of stepping back and trying to observe, you know, if there's a better, more purposeful way that she could be living.
Right.
And that segues into what he talks about, just about how thinking is listening to yourself, and I would love to talk about that here.
So just kind of to come to an understanding, though, on what we just discussed, maybe, both of your guys' perspectives are very valid in that Peterson could have done a better job giving credibility to the movement or her own experience and recognize that this does happen to people and that it shouldn't. But then on the same side, he's more so maybe trying to model how to have a conversation with someone that is trying to relay something that's very important to them, that is potentially life-changing or traumatic, and to not influence them based on your own predisposed either problems or ideas. Does that seem like a fair spot to kind of end on that story?
We've put that together in a way, and I better understand his points because we had this conversation. I appreciate that summary.
Awesome. Truthfully, I didn't make a ton of notes on that section or anything, but I'm glad that we dug into it deeper, because on the first reading I just kind of glanced over it.
And I agree with that too, because obviously you guys know I hold him in a very high perspective. So as I'm reading this, I was reading it from how I think I know him, and I don't think I know him in a way that would downplay these type of things. So I didn't exactly glance over it, but I definitely didn't consider further implications. So that's definitely interesting for me too. I appreciate that as well.
Yeah, it's good to have different perspectives.
That's the whole point of the podcast, right? That's why we're doing this. Yeah.
It's funny what just happened ties in well
exactly.
to what this chapter is about and what this podcast is supposed to be about.
And that just makes me want to say how much I appreciate my two closest friends, Logan and Patrick, here, because we are able to come from different knowledge bases and different interests and things, but that doesn't matter because we are very much unified in our walk with Jesus, and we're very much unified in treating people with dignity and respect, and seeing people as people who can think for themselves. And that's what I just love about our relationship and this podcast as well. So,
thank you for tuning into this week's book club discussion. Please let us know if you have any suggestions as to books we should read or topics we should discuss by contacting us at beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. Again, that's beingbecomingpodcast@gmail.com. We hope you join us next week for another engaging conversation.